The evening lights of Paris glowed softly against the Seine, shimmering like liquid gold as the world's elite gathered at one of the most prestigious restaurants in the city, a place where the air itself seemed to carry an air of quiet arrogance, as if only the powerful, the wealthy, and the untouchable belonged within its walls. At a corner table draped in pristine white linen, sat Alexander Hartwell, the CEO of one of the largest multinational tech corporations in the world, a man used to boardrooms, billion-dollar deals, and journalists whispering his name with awe. To everyone watching, he was the picture of power, tall, broad-shouldered, impeccably dressed in a navy blue tailored suit that clung to his frame with the ease of money, his expensive wristwatch glinting beneath the crystal chandeliers. But as the waiter placed the elegantly written French menu in front of him, his confidence wavered, and behind those piercing steel-gray eyes there flickered a small storm of panic. He glanced at the curling, poetic French words written across the pagina, words that looked like art but meant nothing to him. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his fingers tightening around a leather-bound menu. He could close deals in minutes, control entire markets, negotiate mergers across continents. But here, in this restaurant filled with foreign elegance, he was powerless. He couldn't read a single word of the menu. For years, Alexander had relied on assistants, translators, or the safety net of ordering the safest dish with the waiter's guidance. But tonight, things were different. He was here with high-profile French investors who expected sophistication, culture, and respect for their language. He knew that if he asked the waiter for help, or worse, admitted he didn't understand, the carefully crafted aura of dominance and perfection he carried everywhere would fracture. His heart beat a little faster, betraying a vulnerability he had buried under years of relentless ambition. He raised his eyes, scanning the room, searching for some distraction, when his gaze fell upon a table not far from his own. At that table sat a man in his mid-30s, dressed simply in a worn jacket and faded shirt, nothing flashy, no air of wealth or superiority. Across from him sat a little girl, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, her dark curls bouncing as she giggled at something her father had said. The man smiled warmly, his rough hands gently cutting her food, his demeanor patient and tender, a stark contrast to the cold efficiency Alexander had always associated with fathers. The man's posture was straight, his eyes sharp, carrying the kind of quiet strength that didn't need a suit or spotlight. For a moment, Alexander found himself oddly drawn to the scene of father and daughter in a restaurant where they didn't seem to quite belong, but somehow radiated more dignity than anyone else in the room. As the waiter returned to his side, expectant and polite, Alexander's palms grew clammy. He tried to stall, pretending to browse the menu again, hoping that some miracle would help him decipher the beautiful nonsense on the page. "Monsieur, are you ready to order?" the waiter asked in polite, crisp French-accented English. Alexander opened his mouth, but no words came. He could feel the eyes of the investors at the table across from him, curious, waiting to see how he handled himself. Every second of silence was another crack in the fatal Section 8 he had built so carefully. He was about to mumble something generic, to surrender to embarrassment, when a smooth, confident voice broke through the tension. "Excuse me, sir," the voice said in perfect, flowing French. "If you don't mind, I can assist." Alexander turned his head sharply. It was a man at the nearby table, the same man who had been smiling at his daughter only moments ago. He spoke with such ease, such fluency, that even the waiter seemed impressed. Without hesitation, the man began to converse with the waiter in French, pointing to items on the menu, suggesting dishes, wine pairings, even a dessert that would match the evening's tone. His words rolled effortlessly, rich with an accent that carried not only fluency but respect for the culture. The investors watching Alexander smiled with approval, clearly impressed. In their eyes, this was Alexander's doing. They assumed this humble man was part of his entourage, maybe an assistant or a consultant, someone he had cleverly brought along. Alexander, too stunned to correct them, allowed the illusion to settle over the table. Relief washed over him like a wave. His heart slowed, his palms dried, and for the first time that evening, he felt like he could breathe. "Merci, monsieur," the waiter said gratefully before walking away with the order. The man gave Alexander a polite nod, then turned back to his daughter as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't just saved the billionaire CEO from humiliation in front of his peers. Alexander leaned back in his chair, staring at the man with new eyes. Who was he? Why did he speak French so effortlessly? Why was someone so skilled, so intelligent, dining here in such modest clothes, with only his daughter for company? Something about the man's quiet presence, his unspoken confidence, gnawed at Alexander's curiosity. For the rest of the evening, as the investors chatted about business, as wine flowed and laughter filled the room, Alexander's mind kept drifting back to that table. The little girl's laughter, the man's calm voice, the way he seemed so comfortable in a place where Alexander himself had almost crumbled at it all unsettled him. When the dinner concluded and the investors left satisfied, Alexander lingered. He found himself standing awkwardly near the man's table, unsure how to begin a conversation. Finally, he cleared his throat. "That was a broken bar, impressive," Alexander said, his voice lower than usual. The man looked up, his eyes a deep shade of brown, steady and unflinching. "It was nothing," he replied simply, shrugging. "Just a menu." "No," Alexander insisted. "It wasn't nothing. You saved me from looking like a fool tonight." The man gave a small smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I only spoke French. Nothing extraordinary." "Extraordinary is exactly what it was," Alexander said, studying him more closely. His jacket was worn at the elbows, his shoes scuffed, yet he held himself with the posture of a soldier, firm and disciplined. "You're fluent?" The man nodded. "I lived in France for some years." "Picked it up along the way." Alexander hesitated, then asked a question that had been circling in his mind all evening. "Who are you?" The man chuckled softly, shaking his head as if the question were both too simple and too complicated. "Just a father," he said, glancing at his daughter, who was busy doodling on a napkin with a pen. "A father trying to give his little girl a nice evening out." Alexander felt something stir in his chest, something unfamiliar, something almost like envy. Here was a man with none of the trappings of wealth, yet he exuded a kind of richness Alexander had never known. "Well," Alexander said, his tone more genuine than he intended, "you did more than that tonight. You saved me, and I don't forget things like that." The man gave another small nod, not asking for thanks, not fishing for recognition. He simply returned his focus to his daughter, as if she were the only world that mattered. For the first time in years, Alexander Hartwell, the man who had everything, walked away feeling like he had just met someone who carried more power than he did, a power that came not from money, but from humility, love, and quiet strength. And deep down, Alexander knew this was not the last time their paths would cross. The night after their brief encounter, Alexander Hartwell sat in his penthouse suite overlooking the city of Paris, the skyline glittering like diamonds scattered across velvet. Yet for once, the view did not fill him with pride or satisfaction. Instead, his thoughts lingered on the maddest man at the restaurant, the stranger who had rescued him with effortless grace and then faded back into the background without asking for thanks, praise, or recognition. Alexander had built his empire on power, on being the man everyone noticed when he entered a room. Yet this man had shown strength by simply existing quietly, a single father with a little girl whose smile had lit up the restaurant more than the chandeliers. Something in Alexander's chest twisted uncomfortably. He realized he hadn't even asked the man's name. The following day, when business concluded and his schedule cleared, Alexander found himself walking back to the same restaurant, an odd determination guiding his steps. He asked discreetly about the man who had dined there the night before. The staff remembered him well, not because of his wealth, but because of his warmth. "A kind gentleman," one waiter said, "speaks French like a native, comes sometimes with his little girl, very polite, very broken bar humble." With a bit more gentle prodding, Alexander discovered the man's name, Daniel Brooks. That evening, unable to shake the curiosity, Alexander asked his driver to take him to a modest neighborhood on the outskirts of Paris where he was told Daniel lived. The contrast could not have been sharper. Gone were the glittering boulevards and shining storefronts here. The streets were narrow, lined with simple apartments where laundry fluttered from balconies, and children played soccer with dented balls in the fading light. Alexander, A man who lived among the world's elite, felt strangely out of place, but he pressed on until he saw Daniel, carrying groceries in one arm while his daughter held his other hand. They were laughing about something, and Alexander paused, struck by how genuine it looked, how unforced. For a moment, he felt like an intruder, peering into a life he had never known. But then Daniel noticed him, surprise flickering across his face. "Mr. Hartwell?" Daniel asked cautiously, adjusting the grocery bag. Alexander felt oddly awkward, a sensation foreign to him. "Yeah, I hope I'm not intruding. I just a broken bar wanted to thank you properly for last night." Daniel studied him for a moment, then gave a small smile. "There's no need. You already thanked me." "Still," Alexander said, clearing his throat, "I'd like to do something in return. Maybe dinner? A chance to talk." Daniel hesitated, glancing at his daughter, who was already tugging at his arm, whispering curiously. Finally, he nodded. "All right, but nothing fancy. She doesn't like sitting still in restaurants for too long." The next evening, they met again, up this time at a small family-owned diner tucked into a quiet street, the kind of place Alexander had never been to in his life. The food was simple, hearty, nothing like the haute cuisine he was used to, but Daniel's daughter giggled through the meal, and Daniel himself seemed more at ease here, his posture relaxed, his laughter genuine. As the night unfolded, Alexander finally asked the question that had been weighing on him. "Daniel, you're broken bar different. You carry yourself with such strength. Were you in the military?" Daniel's eyes flickered, and for a moment his jaw tightened, the smile fading. But then he nodded slowly. "Yes. U.S. Army. Served for almost a decade. Deployed overseas. Saw things I wouldn't wish on anyone." Silence hung heavy for a moment. Alexander felt the gravity in Daniel's words, the invisible scars carried in his tone. "And your daughter?" Alexander asked gently. Daniel's expression softened immediately as he looked at her. "Her name's Emily. She's my whole world. Her mother broken bar. She passed away when Emily was 3. It's been just us ever since." Alexander swallowed hard, his throat suddenly tight. He thought of his own life, the emptiness of it despite all the wealth, the lack of genuine laughter, the coldness of boardrooms compared to